Today the Bible is under accusation and attack from many sources. It is said to be uninspired, unhistoric, unreliable, unscientific, irrelevant to our modern society, of no use for moral guidance today, and fully contradictory. And those who would believe the Bible and place their faith in it, what are they considered by the intelligentsia and the elite to be? Well, they're uneducated, unenlightened, unintelligent, uninformed, unstable, emotionally dependent, misguided, foolish, backward, stupid, and ignorant. With such proclamations as these, in one guise or another, the population in general is bombarded as we see such statements coming out in an ever-widening, rapidly flowing river from the spokesmen of modern science, by the teachers of modern religion, by press, by television, by radio, by day and by night. Because today it's smart to laugh at God. It's intelligent to ridicule the Bible. So the population in general assumes that these accusations must essentially be true. And unread and untaught in the Bible themselves, most people today conclude that the Bible is fable, myth, and superstition, or at least in part it is these things. Now, to all who would hurl such accusations at Holy Scripture, or who would harbor such sentiments in their hearts, we say, pay attention to prophecy. For this morning we are going to present a few of the mountains of credentials that the Bible has as to its inspired authenticity. These will be facts, not opinions. Verified history, not conjecture, is what we shall consider. And our confidence is that these proofs are of such a dynamic and dramatic character as to convince any open mind that surely the Bible could be of no other source than man's creator, that the Bible is inspired, it is reliable, it is of divine origin, and it is understandable, and that this book carries on every page the fingerprint of God. If this be true, and you are to be the judge of that, then the promises in the Bible are divine guarantees, and the goal of everlasting life toward which we are directed by Holy Scripture is a certain assured reward. And most importantly, according to Bible prophecy, which we shall find is true, the hope of everlasting life is an immediate reality in the immediate future. And so now we say, pay attention to prophecy. But to illustrate the remarkable nature and the incomparable scope of Bible prophecy, let's now ask our skeptics to do something for us. Let's see how well they can prophesy concerning the future, shall we? All right, first let's select 4 nations, or cities, that is, and 3 nations that are prominent in the Middle East today, a scene of historic and current world dispute. Let's take Damascus, Ammon, Baghdad, and Tehran. These are the capitals of Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and Iran. And let's add to these cities the nations of Israel, Lebanon, and Saudi Arabia. So we have 4 cities and 3 nations. Now please, Mr. Skeptic, make plain to us the foundation of your wisdom. Show us your understanding. Tell us, please, now, 2,500 years from today, in the year 4472, what will have happened to each of these cities and peoples? Will the cities be flourishing, or if not, which ones will be emptied? What will be the manner of their downfall? And what about the Jordanians, the Israelis, the Saudi Arabians, and the Lebanese? Will they still be in their own land, speaking their own language, or will they be absorbed in the national identities of peoples yet to come until they are, in the future, 4472, only existent in dusty memory. What will happen to these peoples, these cities, these nations? Have you no answer, O you highly intelligent critic of the Bible? Well, then keep silent and pay attention to Bible prophecy, inspired and divine and accurate, as we consider prophecies of a nature precisely like these, which were recorded 3,500 years ago and which have been fulfilled and are on record. Let us first consider the prophecies of Tyre. Now, on this map, we have a section of the Near East 700 miles in this dimension and 1,100 miles long. And if you notice the scale down below, we have 300 miles marked out for you. Now, the city of Tyre was a seaport at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, south and east of the island of Cyprus. Incidentally, Brother Scoofus is from right here, up in Asia Minor. We are in Tyre, and we are concerned about the prophecies relating to that city. Now, you know, people have a national identity. For example, Americans like to think of themselves as Uncle Sam. Strong, stern, dependable, just, powerful, capable. Ah, yes, Americans think of themselves as such. Well, we might describe Tyre by the national identity of Captain Tyre. Yes, Captain Tyre was once a sea captain, but now, by clever trading, has come to own a fleet of ships of his own. And he's a great merchant, a merchant captain, still relishing that title. Captain Tyre has seen everything. He's done everything. He would deal on the rope to hang him if he could make enough profit. He feels, as an island, isolated from the results of his activities, because Captain Tyre deals, among other valuable things, in slaves, and thus brings misery to many. But he feels it can never happen to him. He knows too much. He's too clever. Among the slaves with which the city of Tyre dealt, were the people of Judah and of Israel, whom she transported into captivity in many nations after the fall of Israel and then subsequently the fall of the kingdom of Judah. Some of these she transported to Greece. Prophecies were made because Tyre incurred God's divine displeasure concerning her final outcome. And I'd like to have you turn with me, please, to the book of Ezekiel. We're going to be looking at chapter 26, and these prophecies were recorded in 606 BCE, and they did not come to be completely fulfilled for 1,700 years. Long after the Bible was written, there can be no question about which came first, the prophecy or the fulfillment. So now, pay attention to prophecy and notice the divine statements that Jehovah makes concerning Tyre. In verse 3, we start in Ezekiel 26, and he says, "Therefore this is what the sovereign Lord Jehovah has said. Here I am against you, O Tyre, and 1. Pay attention to the first prophetic statement here. I will bring up against you many nations, just as the sea brings up its waves. 2. And they will certainly bring down the walls of Tyre to ruin and tear down her temples. 3rd prophetic statement. And I will scrape her dust away from her, and make her a shining bare surface of a crag. 4. And a drying yard for dragnets is what she will become in the midst of the sea." And now we go down to verse 12. Speaking of Nebuchadnezzar, he said, "And he will certainly spoil your resources and plunder your sales goods and tear down your walls and your desirable houses. They will pull down, and your stones, and your woodwork, and your dust they will place in the very midst of the water." And in verse 19, Jehovah again makes this 5th prophetic statement concerning Tyre. Pay attention. "For this is what the sovereign Lord Jehovah has said. When I make you a devastated city like the cities that are actually not inhabited, when I bring up over you the watery deep and the vast waters will have covered you, I shall also bring you down with those going into the pit to the people of long ago." 5 prophetic statements were made concerning Tyre. 1. Jehovah would bring many waves of nations one after another against Tyre. 2. He would bring down her walls and towers. 3, he would scrape away the dust from Tyre's rocks and make the rocks shine in the sun that had been her foundation. In the dew of the morning they would glitter. 4, a drying yard for fish nets Tyre would become. And 5, the city of Tyre. Her sales goods, her valuable things, her stones, her houses, her merchandise, her towers, her walls would be sunk in the sea. Now pay attention to prophecy and see how this was fulfilled. Tyre was a city existing on an island and on the sea coast, as does New York, having Manhattan as an island and then the other boroughs in the mainland. Now, Tyre had a fortified city in the mainland that was very strong and powerful. But in the island, a citadel was considered so unassailable as to be beyond attack and superior to any conqueror. We read something about the nature of Tyre here in the Encyclopedia Americana, and it tells us what happened to the city. But first we want to notice that according to this prophecy in Ezekiel, Nebuchadnezzar was to come up against Tyre. And this he did, and he did it in 587 BCE, according to the Encyclopedia. He attacked the mainland city for a period of 13 years. He set siege to the city, and he finally took it. He pulled down the walls, he destroyed the towers, he leveled the mainland city. But Tyre still stood out in the sea, the island, unassailable, and they escaped. And so as the Bible had actually prophesied, Nebuchadnezzar went away essentially without wages for his long siege against Tyre. Well, Tyre thus had her walls and towers pulled down. The first prophetic statement was fulfilled. What about many nations coming up against it? What about it being laid into the sea? In 332, before our common era, Alexander the Great came against Tyre. And there the city was with a wall 300 feet high facing the mainland, out on the island, and with embankments going down into the sea, over 50 feet into the ocean. So solid were the footings for these towers on the island city. But what did Alexander the Great do, the Greek? He scraped off all the rock and the ruin and the debris from the mainland city and made a causeway, a mole, out to the island city. And the bare rock shone in the sun, in the morning dew, and the rocks, the streets, the houses, the merchandise, the sales goods, the dead in their bones of Tyre were buried into the sea. And then he set siege to the island, and he overthrew it. And the record is that he took 10,000 captives and killed 30,000. And so silent Tyre was laid beneath the waves. And so the second wave was brought against Tyre. But now the prophecy was that many waves would be brought up against. So let's read what the encyclopedia says. The Neo-Babylonian conqueror Nebuchadnezzar II subjected the island to a 13-year siege without success. However, he took the mainland city. The city defied Alexander the Great. With the debris of the mainland portion of the city which he had demolished, he built a huge mole in 332 to join the island to the mainland. After a 7-month siege, in the course of which he employed a fleet provided by Cyprus and Sidon and other Phoenician cities, he captured and destroyed Tyre. About 10,000 of its citizens were slaughtered and 30,000 sold into slavery. This was in 332. In 636, Tyre fell to the Muslim Arabs, 636 AD. In 1124, it was captured by the Crusaders. In 1291, it reverted to the Muslim rule and was reduced almost to ashes. 5 waves of conquest came against Tyre, but it was to become a drying place for fish nets. And we read, what is Tyre today? The inhabitants of modern Tyre, more than half of whom are Muslims, subsist on fishing and the building of small boats, and they dry their nets on the banks of Tyre. Pay attention to prophecy. The prophecy was 2,600 years old, and it's fulfilled in this very day. Every instant every statement of prophecy. Mr. Skeptic, would you care to explain that? Pay attention to God's prophecies concerning Nineveh. As Tyre was a merchant, Nineveh was a warrior, rapacious and cruel. A man ferocious who wanted a reputation of such sanguinary, bloodthirsty character as would frighten all against whom Nineveh would come. For he tortured and destroyed painfully all whom he took in conquest. And his purpose, that of Nineveh, was to so weaken the morale and the will to fight of those nations against which he would come in war that they would surrender immediately. And so Nineveh is described as a bloodthirsty city. And as a warrior, you might imagine it. In Nahum chapter 1, in fact, the entire book of Nahum, and we'll turn to that, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk it is in the Bible, is a description by the prophet of God when Nineveh was a fortress city. And incidentally, the walls of Nineveh are now seen to be 8 miles long, and for about 3 miles they fronted the Tigris River. And you can see Nineveh up here. This is the Tigris River, this is the Euphrates. So Nahum 1:1 we read, the pronouncement against Nineveh, the book of the vision of Nahum the Elkoshite. And this entire prophecy is a statement about God's purposes for Nineveh. Nineveh was the greatest city of the world of its time. Chapter 2, verse 5. He will remember his majestic ones. They will stumble in their walking. They will hasten to her wall, and the barricade will have to be firmly established. The very gates of the rivers will certainly be opened. The palace itself will actually be dissolved. The river would dissolve the walls and the palace, according to this prophecy. Verse 10, emptiness and voidness, a city laid waste. Chapter 3, verse 19, there is no relief to your catastrophe. Your stroke has become unhealable. Now, turn right back to the book of Zephaniah. It's after Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, chapter 2. And I want you to read verse 13 of chapter 2 in Zephaniah. And here Jehovah continues in his prophetic statement against Nineveh. Pay attention. And he will stretch out his hand toward the north, and he will destroy Assyria, the land of Nineveh. And he will make Nineveh a desolate waste, a waterless region like the wilderness. Jehovah prophesied that the greatest city of that day, in the peak of its power, God's prophets audaciously announced that in the near future it would be destroyed and nothing would be there. No one would live there. It would be inhabited by animals. Flocks of shepherds from nearby towns would graze in Nineveh. What happened? What happened? In 612 BCE, the combined armies of the Medes and Babylonians came up against Nineveh. Nineveh had gained so much hatred in the hearts of her surrounding nations that she had no ally. And as they set siege against the mighty city of Nineveh, the Tigris River overflowed, and it carried away the wall facing the river, upon which the palace was too, incidentally. And so the palace was dissolved, the wall was dissolved, and Nineveh fell without a siege to the Medes and Babylonians. So the prophecy in Nahum 2, 5, and 6 was fulfilled where the palace was dissolved. But go further. Let's read now in the Wycliffe Historical Geography a description of Nineveh. By tracing the ruins of Nineveh's ancient walls, archaeologists have been able to determine that the city extended about 2.5 miles along the river. The eastern wall was 3 miles long. The Israelite prophets Jonah and Nahum pronounced judgment upon Nineveh for her atrocities when her armies seemed invincible. By 612 BC, however, Assyria was on the defensive. Her cruelties were known throughout Western Asia. She had no allies. So when she had to face the combined might of the Babylons and Medes, she was unprepared. The destruction of Nineveh was final when Xenophon and his 10,000 Greeks fought their way through the wilderness and mountains of the Black Sea in 400 BC. They passed the ruins of Nineveh, but they were not aware that some 2 centuries earlier, the greatest city of the world had stood on its site. Xenophon did not even mention Nineveh. An Englishman, Sir Anthony Shirley, journeyed to the east at the close of the 16th century and announced, "Nineveh, that which God himself called the great city, hath not one stone standing which may give meaning to being a town. And no one lives in Nineveh today. It's desolate, only shepherds and their flocks and animals." The greatest city on the earth, a desolate condition which has existed now for 24 centuries because God pronounced curse. Suppose London were cursed in such a manner. Would you believe it? It'd be unexpected, wouldn't it? So it was unexpected that Nineveh should be desolate forever, as it is now. We read further, this time in the Encyclopedia Americana, of the nature of Nineveh's ruins. The mounds which mark its ruins are situated on the east bank of the Tigris. The city walls, clearly visible in the outline, are 8 miles long. The northern and larger mound is one of the largest in Mesopotamia, and it is estimated that over 14 million tons of earth would have to be moved to excavate it completely. The end came in 612 B.C. when it fell to the combined attack of Medes and Babylonians. Nineveh never rose again. Pay attention to prophecy. Let's consider Moab. Moab. What a fine example we have here of a stubborn, willful, ungenerous, inhospitable shepherd who would refuse to do God's will. Inhospitable because it denied courtesy to the Israelites as they journeyed from Egypt to the Promised Land, and a persistent antagonist of Israel and Judah throughout her career. Moab rejoiced when God brought punishment upon Judah and felt great happiness that this nation should be no more, Judah, whom it had hated so greatly. So we turn now to Jeremiah 48, and we're going to see a prophecy in verse 15 concerning Moab. Now here you see it on the chart. It's below the river Arnon. The river Arnon flows into the Dead Sea, which might as well be black, for nothing therein lives. And here the Moabites dwelt, and many of their towns we're going to see mentioned here. 11 cities will be mentioned. And I want you to notice what's going to happen to them. Verse 15 of Jeremiah 48, Moab has been despoiled, and one has gone up against her own cities. Their choicest young men themselves have gone down to the slaughtering, is the utterance of the king, whose name is Jehovah of armies. The disaster in the Moabites is near to come, and their very calamity is actually hurrying up very much. It would be a new, early thing that would happen. And we read now in verse 19, Stand still, look out for the way itself, O inhabitants of Aroer. Ask him that is fleeing and her that is making her escape. Say, what has been brought about? Moab has been put to shame, for she has been struck with terror. Howl and cry out. Tell an Arnon, O men, that Moab has been despoiled. The judgment itself has come to the land of level country, to Holon, to Jahaz, against Mithaiah, and against Dibon, and against Nebo, and against Beth-Diblathaim, and against Kiriathaim, and against Beth-Gamel, and against Beth-Menon, and against Kiriath, and against Bozrah, and against all the cities of the land of Moab, those far away and those near. Verse 42, And Moab will be certain to be annihilated from being a people. For it is against Jehovah that he has put on great errors. The Moabites would disappear. They would become nothing. The Encyclopedia Americana. This prophecy was given in 608 B.C. It was within the next century, Jehovah's destiny hurried upon Moab. We read, Moab, the name of an ancient Semitic people who occupied a rugged tableland between the Dead Sea and the Arabian desert. They had reached a high degree of civilization by the 9th century B.C. The Moabites were a pastoral people, and their country was noted for rich pasturage and its wine. Their supreme god was Chemosh. They were eventually invaded by tribes from the Arabian desert. Jehovah prophesied that too. And their national existence came to an end in the 6th century B.C. Who are the Moabites? There are no Moabites. Jehovah said there would be none. Pay attention to prophecy. And what about those cities, 11 of which are named here in verses 19 through 24? Well, of those 11, 7 have never been found. The ruins of 4 others have been located, and only upon 2 do modern villages exist. Pay attention to prophecy. All right? Moab, a shepherd. Ammon, a farmer. A man of the soil. Uncaring, unheeding, rebellious, self-willed, uninterested in the work of God, or in his blessings upon his people, and a persistent, hostile, resentful, jealous nation against Judah and against Israel. And so Jehovah pronounced destiny in Ezekiel chapter 25, and we're going to read some of the prophecies here made. Starting in verse 2, Son of man, set your face against the sons of Ammon, and prophesy against them. And you must say concerning the sons of Ammon, hear the word of the sovereign Lord Jehovah. This is what the sovereign Lord Jehovah has said. For the reason that you have said, aha, against my sanctuary, because it has been profaned, and against the soil of Israel, because it has been laid desolate, and against the house of Judah, because they have gone into exile. Therefore I am giving you to the Orientals as something to possess. You see, the Moabites rejoiced when Nebuchadnezzar took the Ammonites rejoiced when Nebuchadnezzar took the Judeans into captivity. And they said, aha, and we will go and possess some of their riches, and we'll take much of their former estate. And Jehovah had no purpose for them to accomplish this. And so he promised to give them to the Orientals. Now the term Oriental referred to ones from the east, Arabians, Arab nomads. And here we read in verse 6, for this is what the sovereign Lord Jehovah has said. For the reason that you clapped the hands and you stamped with your feet and you kept rejoicing with all the scorn on your part and your soul against the soil of Israel, therefore here I am. I have stretched out my hand against you. I will give you as something to plunder to the nations. I will cut you off from the peoples and destroy you out of the land. I shall annihilate you. And you have to know that I am Jehovah. And what is there of Ammon today? He said he would annihilate them, cut them off from being among the peoples. Do you know any Ammonites? Have you heard of them in the news reports? Listen to the Encyclopedia Americana. Under Ammonites it says, an ancient people that lived in the region south of Jabbok and lived east of the Jordan. They were worshippers of Moloch and enemies of Israel and Judah. They were absorbed about the 1st century A.D. by the Nabatean Arabs, the Orientals who came from the east, and they were absorbed. And Ammon is no more. Jehovah said it would not be. 600 years after the prophecy, it was fulfilled. No question about which came first, the prophecy or the fulfillment. Pay attention to prophecy. Let's consider Edom. The Edomites, well, they lived in a high plateau, in wilderness on either side, and they were vine dressers. They loved wine. But Edom was the dregs in the winepress. Descendants of Esau, they had persistently been at disharmony and enmity and bloodshed with Israel and Judah. And so Jehovah pronounced sentence upon them. In Jeremiah 49, verse 17 and 18, this prophecy being made in 580 B.C. And notice how specifically Jehovah's prophecy was given here in verse 17. And Edom must become an object of astonishment. Everyone passing along by her will stare in astonishment and whistle on account of her plagues. Just as the overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah and her neighbor towns, Jehovah has said, no man will dwell there, and no son of mankind will reside in her as an alien, just as God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah, which never again have been. So would be Edom, the wine drinker. And what happened to Edom? The prophecy was given 6 centuries B.C. The fulfillment came 700 years later. Edom, in ancient times a country lying in the south of the Dead Sea. During the time of Nebuchadnezzar, they were attacked by the Babylonians. And later, after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D., their fortunes were merged by the Romans and those of Arabia. Edomites disappeared from the face of the earth. There are no Edomites today, nor land of Edom, and their cities are desolate ruins, unnamed, unfound for the most part. Jehovah removed Edom. But you say, Mr. Skeptic, look, those are unimportant little cities and nations of no consequence, transient. Not so. But would you consider it sufficient if we considered the greatest city by many accounts that existed in the days of Alexander the Great? A city so great that he chose to make it his capital for his world empire, a city that was called the center of the earth, a city lush and rich with canals and vegetation and produce, with thousands of ships, more than 3,000, plying the waters, trafficking with the nations earthwide, a city of great wisdom and religion and science and mathematics, the greatest city of its time, a city 15 miles on a side with walls 300 feet high and 3 sets of walls and moats surrounding the city, a city divided into 4 quadrants, each of which was a fortress unassailable, a city designed to stand and last forever, this greatest city of its time, Babylon. Would the removal of Babylon by divine curse be convincing? I have here, thanks to Gene Tennant, who is a Bible study of mine, a textbook called Through Engineering Eyes that is used in college to give a purview of what engineers of ancient times did. It's a credit course textbook for college students in engineering. And they have here a report by a historian by the name of Herodotus. And Herodotus visited Babylon when it was under the rule of other people, and his dating is from 484 to 425 BCE. And so we read, the city stands on a broad plain and is an exact square 15 miles in length each way, so that the entire circuit is 60 miles around Babylon. And there is no other city that approaches to it. It is surrounded in the first place by a broad and deep moat full of water, behind which rises a wall 50 royal cubits in width, that's 80 feet, and 200 in height, that's 320 feet high by 80 feet thick was the wall, the first one. He continues, the city is divided into 2 portions by the river, Euphrates, which runs through it. This river is broad and deep, a swift stream, which rises in Armenia and empties itself into the Persian Gulf. The city wall is brought down on both sides of the river to the edge of the stream. Thence, from the corners of the wall, there is carried along each bank of the river a fence of burnt bricks. The houses are mostly 3 or 4 stories high. The streets all run in straight lines, not only those parallel to the river, but also the cross streets which lead to the water side. At the river end of those cross streets are low gates and the fence that skirts the stream, which are like the great gates in the outer wall of brass and open on the water. Babylon, thus, is described, a square city with a river running through it, walls 300 feet high. There were 3 sets of them, according to Nebuchadnezzar's record found here in the Bible and archaeology, who said, a great wall, which like a mountain cannot be moved, I made of mortar and brick. Its foundation upon the bosom of the abyss I placed down deeply. Its top I raised mountain high. I triplicated the city wall in order to strengthen it. I caused a great protecting wall to run at the foot of the wall of burnt brick. That which no king had done, my father did. in that he enclosed the city with two moat walls of mortar and brick. And as for me, a third great moat wall, one against the second, I built with mortar and brick, and with the moat wall my father joined, closely united. Babylon was an impregnable fortress. To take such a city with bows and arrows and crossbows and battering rams? Oh. So pay attention to prophecy. If Moab, farmer, Ammon, shepherd, and Edom, wine drinkers, Babylon was a harlot. Sensuous, beautiful, delightful to the eye. But she was nevertheless trafficking with all the kings of the earth, a ripe, sensuous sister to all who have ever had or will have power was Babylon. Rich, proud, knowing many secret mysteries and arts, devious, deceptive in her practices, a woman of nights, not of days, and trafficking with the kings of the earth by means of her 3,000 galleys and her many religious sorceries was Babylon, the queen of the waters. And yet Jehovah pronounced sentence against this city when it stood as powerful as it was, and this he did 300 years before its fall, and then 200 years before its fall described the very method by which it would come down in one night. One night. Isaiah, please. 13. Now this prophecy was given in about 732 BCE. And it was 200 years later, I correct myself, that it was fulfilled in 539 BCE. Here I am arousing against them, the Medes, to account silver as nothing, and who as respects gold take no delight in it. And their bows will dash even young men to pieces, and the fruity to the belly they will not pity, for sons their eye will not feel sorry. And Babylon, the decoration of kingdoms, the beauty of the pride of the Chaldeans, must become as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. She will never be inhabited, nor will she reside for generation after generation. There the Arab will not pitch his tent. No shepherds will let their flocks lie down there. And there the haunters of waterless regions will certainly lie down. Their houses will be filled with eagle owls, and there the ostriches must reside. Even her water would be taken from Babylon. She would now be a desert wilderness uninhabited, and a superstitious dread of the city would be upon all the nomads, so that she should be without man. How would this thing come to pass? We'll now turn to Isaiah 44, and notice the description Jehovah gave centuries in advance, including the name of the conqueror. Verse 26 of Isaiah 44. Jehovah speaks of himself as the one making the word of his servant come true, the one that carries out completely the counsel of his own messengers, the one saying of Jerusalem, she will be inhabited, and of the cities of Judah, they will be rebuilt, and her desolated places I shall raise up. Now at the time this prophecy was given, Judah was inhabited. She had not fallen captive. But here Jehovah is saying in advance that he would bring the Jews back from Babylon, and they hadn't gone there yet. Another prophecy which was fulfilled. Incidentally, the exact period of their captivity in Babylon was prophesied also, 70 years, and fulfilled precisely. But we continue here. Verse 27, the one saying to the watery deep, that's the river running through the walls, be evaporated, and all your rivers I shall dry up. The one saying of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and all that I delight in he will completely carry out. Pay attention. It was Cyrus who would do this. And even in my saying of Jerusalem, she will be rebuilt, and of the temple you will have your foundation laid. This is what Jehovah has said to his anointed one, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have taken hold of, to subdue before him nations, so that I may ungird even the hips of kings, to open before him the two-leaved doors, so that even the gates will not be shut. Before you, I myself will go. The swells of land I shall straighten out, The copper doors I shall break in pieces. The iron bars I shall cut down. And I will give you the treasure of darkness and the hidden treasures of concealment places, in order that you may know that I am Jehovah. So Jehovah said, it's unnecessary for human arms to conquer Babylon, for I shall open the doors and give it to Cyrus the Mede. What happened? On the night of October 5th through 6th of 539 B.C., Cyrus came against Babylon with his armies. Belshazzar was so secure in his fortress city that he threw a great feast. He invited 1,000 of his lords and concubines, and there, in their boisterous toasting, they brought forth the very temple vessels that had been used in the sacred service of Jehovah in the temple at Jerusalem, which the Babylonians had taken to their city. And they began to toast their gods of wood and stone and gold, and to boast in their power, with 1,000 harlots and all his grandees. And then suddenly there appeared on the wall the fingers of a man's hand writing, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, numbered, weighed, and divided. And Daniel interpreted that to mean that his kingdom days had been numbered and brought to an end. He had been weighed in the balance and found wanting. His kingdom would be divided and given to the Persians. That night, Cyrus turned aside the river Euphrates and diverted its course by means of his engineers, and marched dry shod on the riverbed. The watery deep was evaporated, said Isaiah, into the heart of the city. And there they found the 2-leaved gates of brass open on the city walls. They clambered up the banks of the river and entered the city that night, killed all they met, and Babylon fell that evening. Pay attention to prophecy. But the prophecy was not yet fulfilled completely. So we must move forward and turn to the book of Jeremiah, and we're going to turn to chapter 50. For Jehovah had prophesied that this greatest of all cities would never be inhabited or used again. And so, Jeremiah 50, verse 13. Because the indignation of Jehovah, she will not be inhabited. She must become a desolate waste in her entirety. As for anyone passing along by Babylon, he will stare in astonishment and whistle on account of all her plagues. Verse 39. Therefore the haunters of waterless regions will dwell with the howling animals, and in her ostriches must dwell, and she will never more be dwelt in, nor will she reside for generation after generation, just as with God's overthrow of Sodom and of Gomorrah, and of her neighbor towns is the utterance of Jehovah, no man will dwell there. And he repeats it again in 51 of Jeremiah, verses 37, 41, 43, and 64. No man shall dwell there. Babylon shall be desolate, a desert. And what is Babylon today? It fell in 539 to the armies of Cyrus. The city was inhabited and used. Even by Alexander the Great, his purpose was to make it his capital. In Roman times, when Peter was upon the earth, he went to Babylon, for still people dwelt there. But 1,200 years after the prophecies were made, that Babylon would never be dwelt in again, in the 4th century of our common era, the city was abandoned. And today, Babylon has no water. There is no city there. There are not even ruins. They're covered with sand. And everyone who sees Babylon whistles and stares in amazement. Was this the great city Babylon? And Babylon has not one single occupation, and all of the nomads and desert dwellers are afraid of the city, for they find it a haunt of demons. And there the jackal and the ostrich and the lizard and the serpent and the eagle owl dwell. A wilderness, forlorn, desolate, abandoned is Babylon. Read now with me, Jeremiah 51:37. And Babylon must become piles of stones and the lair of jackals, an object of astonishment, and something to whistle out without inhabitant. Verse 43. Her cities have become an object of astonishment, a waterless land, a desert plain, as a land in them no man will dwell, and through them no son of mankind will pass. And verse 64, and you must say, this is how Babylon will sink down and never rise up, because of the calamity that I am bringing in upon her, and they will certainly tire themselves out. Pay attention to prophecy. And so we've seen the announcement of Jehovah God against the cities of ancient times that trespassed against him. Without exception, precisely, they were fulfilled. Centuries later, and the fulfillment remains to this very day. Where is Moab, Ammon, and Edom? Where is Babylon and Nineveh? And where are the fishnets dried? But on the walls of Tyre, gleaming in the sun, the bare rocks. But now let's consider Jehovah's prophecy of an entirely different nature. The oldest of all the prophecies that we shall consider is that Jehovah gave concerning Judah. Now, 3,500 years ago, the people who are known today as Jews, their descendants, their ancestors entered into a contract with Jehovah God by means of Moses. And this contract involved their being a special people, and I would have you turn to Deuteronomy 28, verse 15. There were many blessings to be realized in serving Jehovah, a favor and a royal esteem Jehovah would give them until they should become a kingdom of priests, a nation wholly devoted to Jehovah, blessed in every aspect by our God. But if they would not serve Jehovah, this contract involved sanctions or punishments against them. Sanctions written down and agreed to, for the covenant was presented to the body of elders of the Jews, and they accepted it and ratified it and said, all that Jehovah has done we shall do, and we shall accept these conditions upon us. So Deuteronomy 28, Jehovah foretells what should happen in verse 36. Jehovah will, let's start in verse 15. And it must occur that if you will not listen to the voice of Jehovah, your God, by taking care to do all this commandment and his statutes that I am commanding you today, all these maledictions must come upon you and overtake you. Cursed will you be in the city, and cursed will you be in the field. Cursed will be your basket and your kneading trough. Cursed will be the fruit of your barley and the fruitage of your ground, and the young of your cattle and the progeny of your flock. Cursed will you be when you come in, and cursed will you be when you go out. Verse 37. And you must become an object of astonishment, a proverbial saying, and a taunt among all the peoples to whom Jehovah will lead you away. So Jehovah would scatter them, and the word Jew would be a taunt. It would be considered ridicule for someone to be called a Jew or Jewish in his dealings. Jehovah announced this 3,500 years ago. We read verse 64. Jehovah will certainly scatter you among all the peoples, from one end of the earth to the other end of the earth. And there you will have to serve other gods. Verse 66. And you will certainly be in the greatest peril for your life, and be in dread night and day, and you will not be sure of your life. In the morning you will say, if only it were evening. And in the evening you will say, if only it were morning. Because of the dread of your heart with which you will be in dread, and because of the sight of your eyes that you will see. And Jehovah will certainly bring you back to Egypt. Pay attention. By ships. By the way about which I have said to you, you will never see it again. Well, Jehovah prophesied here that he would scatter the Jews among all the nations. Their name would be a taunt and a reproach. Well, how did this begin to be fulfilled? They were scattered first to Babylon, but recovered because of repentance, and Jehovah's anger fulfilled upon them in 537 B.C. and restored in their land. But they filled up the iniquity of their forefathers when they put to death the one whom God had sent as their king. And in Matthew 27:25, they said, when Pilate said, I am clean of the blood of this man, as he washed his hands, the Jewish leader said, let his blood come to be upon us and upon our children. And so they filled up the iniquity of their forefathers who had slain Jehovah's prophets, and now they killed his son. And Jehovah accepted that self-pronounced curse by the Jews. And so we find a record here by Josephus, a Jewish historian in Roman early times, about the 1st century A.D. And in his book, Wars of the Jews, book 6, we read of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. The Jewish Passover was in operation. Now, Christians no longer observe the Passover because Christ, the Passover sacrifice, had been provided. And the sacrifices of sheep were no longer of value before Jehovah. So he caused that gift offering and oblation to cease. But the Jews who had pronounced the curse upon themselves, let his blood be upon us, were still carrying out the fruitless rituals of the law which Jehovah had now canceled. And so in AD 70, they were gathered for the Passover, and Jews from all over the land came, all over many nations. And they gathered into Jerusalem and swelled the city to bulging numbers. And then the Roman armies under Titus came, and they besieged the city, and they put it to the sword and the torch. And listen to the description of the destruction. The number of those that were carried captive during this whole war was collected to be 97,000, and the number of those that perished during the whole siege were 1,100,000. 1,100,000 Jews were put to death in Jerusalem, the greater part of whom were indeed in the same nation with the citizens of Jerusalem, but not belonging to the city itself, for they were come from all the country to the feast of unleavened bread, and were on a sudden shut up by an army. Now this vast multitude of those that therein perished exceeded all the destructions that either men or God had ever brought upon the world. It was the greatest single destruction in history, says this historian, up to that point. 1,100,000 Jews were destroyed. Well, now Moab, Ammon, and Edom disappeared when they were conquered. Babylon and Nineveh are no more. Tyre is but relatively few. But Jehovah had not said that Judah and Jerusalem and the Jews would be extinguished. No, Jesus said in Luke 21:24 that Jerusalem would be trodden down until the times of the Gentiles would be fulfilled, which meant that there would be Jews on the earth recognized as a people 2,000 years later, to our very day. Thus they would be scattered and dispersed, but they would not be extinguished. Now, can you figure that out? We're going to take a nation and destroy its city and kill 90% of the occupants thereof and take 10% and scatter them across the earth, and 20 centuries later we want to find those same people speaking the language of their own and recognized. They'd be absorbed. But Jehovah had said they would not be. But he had also said he would send a sword after them. And you remember he said he would bring them back to Egypt? Well, we turn back one page and we read of what did happen. But so Fonto slew all those that had been seditious and robbers who were impeached by one another. But of the young men he chose out the tallest and the most beautiful and reserved them for the triumph march. As for the rest of the multitude that were above 17 years of age, he put them into bonds and sent them to the Egyptian mines. By ships he sent them back to Egypt, the history says. Pay attention to prophecy. But has there been a sword upon the Jews through the 20th century since the fall of Jerusalem? 20 years ago, the greatest slaughter of people who were descendants of Abram was in full force. It's 30 years now, as Hitler destroyed 6 million Jews. And the curse which they had pronounced upon themselves, let his blood be upon us and our children, and the curse of Deuteronomy 28, which Jehovah said will happen if you disobey, I will send a sword after you, has been visited upon them down to this very day. And the word Jew today, by bigots and by those who have no sense of understanding, is a word of hatred, is it not? In fact, it's used as a verb to mean cheat. It is a taunt and a reproach among all the nations. 35 centuries after Deuteronomy, those words have been fulfilled in a precise way, absolutely unimaginable. How could the Jews be preserved except that God had guaranteed that they should be so? Pay attention to prophecy. Now, we have examined Jehovah's prophetic statements concerning many nations. We're concerned about the future, though. Well, we don't have time to go into the future, but we'll give you a glimpse of Bible statements. Jehovah in the book of Jeremiah 25 describes his purposes and prophecies not only against the nations we've described, but against many nations, all the nations of the world. And Jehovah has assured us that every human government shall be removed. And the purpose of this, as well explained in the Bible, is for the establishment of a kingdom, rule from heaven, which will bless mankind with peace, health, and everlasting life. The Bible timetable points to the fall of the year 1975 as the time by which this kingdom will have destroyed all its enemies, and there will be laying upon the earth only God slain, and living upon it the remnant of those who survive, as did Noah, as did Lot. We are within 1,300 days, if we understand the Bible chronology correctly, and it's precise, easily read one, of Jehovah's full fulfillment of these inspired words in Jeremiah 25. We start reading in verse 15. For this is what Jehovah the God of Israel has said to me. Take this cup of the wine of the rage out of my hand, and you must make all the nations to whom I am sending you drink it. And they must drink and shake back and forth and act like crazed men because of the sword that I am sending among them. And I proceeded to take the cup out of the hand of Jehovah, and to make all the nations drink to whom Jehovah had sent me, namely Jerusalem and the cities of Judah, and her kings and her princes, and to make them a devastated place, an object of astonishment, something to whistle at and a malediction, just as at this day. Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and his servants and his princes, and all his people, and all the mixed company, and all the kings of the land of Uz, and all the kings of the land of the Philistines, and Ashkelon, and Gaza, and Ekron, and the remnant of Ashdod, Edom, and Moab, and the sons of Ammon, and all the kings of Tyre, and all the kings of Sidon, and the kings of the island that is in the region of the sea, and Dedan, and Tema, and Buz, and all those with hair clipped at the temples, and all the kings of the Arabs, and all the kings of the mixed company who are residing in the wilderness, and all the kings of Zimri, and all the kings of Elam, the Babylonians, and all the kings of the Medes, and all the kings of the north who are near and far away, one after another, and all the other kingdoms of the earth that are on the surface of the ground, and the king of Shishak himself shall drink after them, and all the nations of this earth are condemned. Now you can survive the condemnation if you pay attention to prophecy. Jehovah's Witnesses exist today to announce prophecy to you. For all the nations and their armies and their citizens, except those marked on their forehead with knowledge of prophecy and identification as belonging to Jehovah, are to be destroyed within the immediate years. And you shall see this. Pay attention to prophecy. Study the Bible, accept it as God's word, and line yourself up for life that shall never end, rather than rejecting prophecy, shrugging off the evidence, and saying the Bible is untrue. God would never do such a thing. You can be assured that his will should be accomplished. May it bring life to you as prophecy you listen to.